Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Military Career of Napoleon the Great by Montgomery Gibbs. Chapter 13, The Campaign of 1813.
To the premature cold and burning of Moscow, Napoleon attributed the failure of his campaign in Russia. His arrival at the Tuileries had been preceded by the 29th Bulletin, in which the fatal events of the campaign were fully and graphically recited. While he had not been able to conquer the elements, he found the Senate and all the public bodies full of adulation and willingness to obey his commands. However, what had been foreseen by almost every person of discernment, except Napoleon, soon followed, viz., an alliance against France by Prussia, Russia, and Austria. New conscriptions were now called for and yielded. Regiments arrived from Spain and Italy. Every arsenal resounded with the preparation of new artillery. The wonderful energies of Napoleon's mind, says Scott, and the influence which he could exert over the minds of others, were never so striking as at this period of his reign. He had returned to the seat of his empire at a dreadful crisis and in a most calamitous condition. His subjects had been ignorant for 3 weeks whether he was dead or alive. When he arrived, it was to declare a dreadful catastrophe. Yet Napoleon came and seemed but to stamp on the earth, and armed legions arose at his call. The doubts and discontents of the public disappeared as mists at sunrising, and the same confidence which had attended his prosperous fortunes revived in its full extent, despite of his late reverses. Ere many weeks had elapsed, Napoleon found himself once more in a condition to take the field with not less than 350,000 soldiers. Such was the effect of his new appeal to the national feelings of the French people. Meanwhile, the French garrisons dispersed over the Prussian territory were wholly incompetent to overawe a nation which thirsted for vengeance. The king endeavored to protect Napoleon's soldiers, but it soon became manifest that their safety must depend on their concentrating themselves in a small number of fortified towns. Murat now resigned command of the troops, being succeeded by Eugene Beauharnais, who had the full confidence of the emperor. The new commander found that Frederick William could no longer, even if he would, repress the universal enthusiasm of the Prussians who were clamorous for war. On the 31st of January, 1813, the king made his escape to Breslau, in which neighborhood no French were garrisoned, erected his standard, and called on the nation to rise in arms. Eugene, thereupon, retired to Magdeburg and shut himself up in that great fortress, with as many of the troops as he could assemble to the west of the Elbe. When Napoleon heard that Prussia had declared war against France, he said with perfect calmness, "It is better to have a declared enemy than a doubtful ally." It was now 6 years since the fatal day of Jena, and in spite of all of Napoleon's watchfulness, the Prussian nation had recovered, in a great measure, its energies. The people answered the call as with the heart and voice of one man. Youths of all ranks, the highest and the lowest, flocked indiscriminately to the standard. The women poured their trinkets into the king's treasure, the gentlemen melted their plate. England poured in her gold with a lavish hand. The thunder of the cannon of the Beresina had raised the hopes of the House of Bourbon until Louis XVIII finally caused to be published in England and distributed throughout the continent a proclamation in which he addressed himself to the people, adroitly supporting the common opinion which attributed to Napoleon the prolongation of the war, and promising, among other things, to abolish the conscription. The Emperor of Russia was no sooner aware of this great movement than he resolved to advance into Silesia. Having masked several French garrisons in Prussian Poland and taken others, he pushed on with his main army to support Frederick William. Evidently, he did not intend to permit the Prussians to stand alone the first onset of Napoleon, of whose extensive arrangements all Europe was aware. The two sovereigns met at Breslau on the 15th of March. Tears rushed down the cheeks of Frederick William as he fell into the arms of Alexander. "Wipe them," said the Tsar. "They are the last that Napoleon shall ever cause you to shed." The aged Kutuzov having died, the command of the Russian army was now given to Wittgenstein, while that of the Prussians was entrusted to Blücher, an officer who had originally trained under the great Frederick and who, since the Battle of Jena, had lived in retirement. The soldiers had long before bestowed on him the title Marshal Forwards, and they heard of his appointment with delight. Blucher hated the very names of France and Bonaparte, and once more permitted to draw his sword, he swore never to sheathe it until the revenge of Prussia was complete. Bernadotte, now the Crown Prince of Sweden and an ingrate, owing not only his position but his very existence to Napoleon, now landed at Stralsund and advanced through Mecklenburg, while the sovereigns of Russia and Prussia were concentrating their armies in Silesia. It was announced and expected that German troops would join Bernadotte, so as to enable him to open the campaign on the lower Elbe with a separate army of 100,000 men. Wellington, too, was about to advance once more into Spain with his victorious armies. Three great armies, two of which might easily communicate with each other, were thus taking the field against Napoleon at once. Ere the emperor once more left Paris, he named Marie-Louise Empress Regent of France in his absence. As the time approached when he was expected to assume the command of his army in the field, his devoted subjects again and again expressed their loyalty to him and to France. He quitted Paris in the middle of April. On starting to join his youthful and inexperienced army at Erfurt, Napoleon said, "I envy the lot of the meanest peasant in my dominion. At my age, he has fulfilled his duties to his country, and he may remain at home, enjoying the society of his wife and children, while I must fly to the camp and engage in the strife of war. Such is my fate." "My good Louise," he said at the same time, "is gentle and submissive. I can trust her. Her love and fidelity for me will never fail. In the current of events, there may arise circumstances which decide the fate of an empire. In that case, I hope the daughter of the Caesars will be inspired by the spirit of her grandmother, Maria Theresa." In 3 months, an army of 350,000 men was raised, equipped, and brought together, and General Ségur says, "At any hour of the day or night, the emperor, whatever he was doing, could have told the numbers, the composition, the strength of every one of the thousands of detachments of every branch of the service which he set in movement from every part of the empire. The way they were uniformed or equipped, the number of marches each one had to make, the day, the place, even the hour at which each was to arrive." On the 18th, he reached the banks of the Saale, where the troops he had been mustering and organizing in France had now been joined by Eugene and the garrison of Magdeburg. The Tsar and his Prussian ally were known to be at Dresden, and it soon appeared that, while they meditated a march westwards on Leipzig, the French intended to move eastward with a view of securing the possession of that great city. He had a host nearly 200,000 strong concentrating for action, while reserves of almost equal numbers were gradually forming behind him on the Rhine. Napoleon arrived at Erfurt on the 23rd of April, whilst Marshal Ney was taking possession of Weissenfels, after a contest which caused him to say he had never at any one time seen so much enthusiasm and sang-froid in the infantry. And yet the veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, and Wagram had nearly all disappeared from the ranks, and the honor of those eagles, so long victorious, had been committed to young conscripts, hardly conversant with their exercise, and by no means habituated to the fatigues of war. The armies met on the 1st of May, sooner than Napoleon had ventured to hope, near the town of Lutzen, then celebrated as the scene of the battle in which King Gustavus Adolphus died. The evening before the battle, Marshal Bessieres was forcing a defile near Pozerna, and having, according to custom, advanced into the very midst of the skirmishers, a musket ball struck him in the breast and extended him lifeless on the ground. His death was concealed from the brave men he had so long commanded and by whom he was greatly beloved, until after the victory of the following day. The Allies crossed the Elster suddenly, under the cover of a thick morning fog, and attacked the left flank of the French, who had been advancing in column, and who thus commenced the action under heavy disadvantages. But the emperor so skillfully altered the arrangement of his army that ere the day closed, the Allies were more afraid of being enclosed to their ruin within his 2 wings than hopeful of being able to cut through and destroy that part of his force which they had originally charged and weakened, and which had now become his center. Night interrupted the conflict, and the next morning the enemy retreated, leaving Napoleon in possession of the field. His victory was less complete than was desirable, although he lost but 10 or 12,000 men, while the Allies lost above 20,000. A great moral effect was, however, produced by the battle. Napoleon, who had been regarded as already conquered, was again victorious. The emperor immediately sent dispatches to every court in alliance with France to announce the event. "In my young soldiers," he said, "I have found all the valor of my old companions in arms. During the 20 years that I have commanded the French troops, I have never witnessed more bravery and devotion. If all the Allied sovereigns and the ministers who direct their cabinets had been present on the field of battle, they would have renounced the vain hope of causing the star of France to decline." Beaten at Lutzen, Alexander and the King of Prussia fell back on Leipzig, thence on Dresden, and finally across the Elbe to Bautzen. A want of cavalry prevented their pursuit. Napoleon entered Dresden on the 11th of May, and on the 12th was joined by the King of Saxony, who still adhered to him. The Saxon troops once more decided to act in concert with the French. As Napoleon approached Dresden, he was waited upon by the magistrates who had been treacherous to him and to their king, and had welcomed the Allies. "Who are you?" Napoleon asked severely. "Members of the municipality," replied the trembling burgomasters. "Have you bread for my troops?" inquired Napoleon. "Our resources," they answered, "have been entirely exhausted by the requisitions of the Russians and Prussians." "Ah!" replied Napoleon. "It is impossible, is it? I know no such word. Get ready bread, meat, and wine. You richly deserve to be treated as a conquered people. But I forgive all from regard for your king. He is the savior of your country. You have been already punished by the presence of the Russians and Prussians, and having been governed by Baron Stein." On becoming master of Dresden, the emperor, as usual, sent proposals of a pacific nature to the Allies, suggesting that a general congress should assemble at Prague to treat for peace. Neither Russia nor Prussia, however, would listen favorably to what they considered would be an admission of their incapacity to realize their boast of speedily dethroning the scourge and tyrant of Europe and mankind. Austria had been sounded and expressed her willingness to join the coalition on the first favorable opportunity. She was at this time increasing her military establishment largely, and a great body of troops was already concentrated behind the mountainous frontier of Bohemia. Austria, therefore, was enabled to turn the scale on whichever side she might choose. Napoleon now determined to crush the army which had retreated from Lutzen, ere the ceremonious cabinet of Vienna should have time to come to a distinct understanding with the headquarters of Alexander and Frederick William. That victory was the best method of securing Austria's help, Napoleon clearly saw. The Allies, on their retreat, had blown up the magnificent bridge over the Elbe at Dresden, and this being replaced in part by some arches of wood, Napoleon now moved towards Bautzen and came in sight of the enemy on the morning of the 21st of May. The position of the Allies was almost perfect. In their front was the river Spree. Wooded hills supported their right, and eminences well fortified their left. The action began with an attempt to turn their right, but Barclay de Tolly anticipated this movement and repelled it with such vigor that a whole column of 7,000 dispersed and fled into the hills of Bohemia for safety. Napoleon now determined to pass the Spree in front of the enemy, and they permitted him to do so, rather than come down from their position. He took up his quarters in the town of Bautzen, and his whole army bivouacked in presence of the Allies. The battle was resumed at daybreak on the 22nd, when Ney on the right and Oudinot on the left attempted simultaneously to turn the flanks of the position, while Soult and Napoleon himself directed charge after charge on the center. During 4 hours, the struggle was maintained with unflinching obstinacy. The wooded heights, where Blücher commanded, had been taken and retaken several times ere the Allies perceived the necessity of retiring or losing the engagement. They finally withdrew, panic-stricken, continuing their retreat with such celerity as to gain time to rally on the roads leading to Bohemia, all others being closed against them. The want of cavalry, however, again prevented Napoleon from turning his success to account. During the whole of the ensuing day, Napoleon, at the head of the cavalry of the guard, urged pursuit and exposed at all times his own person in the very hottest of the fire. By his side was Duroc, Grand Master of the palace, his dearest friend. "Duroc," said the emperor on the morning of the battle, "fortune has a spite at us today." About 7 o'clock in the evening, Duroc was conversing on a slight eminence, and at a considerable distance from the firing, with Marshal Mortier and General Kurganer, all three on foot, when a cannonball aimed at the group plowed up the ground near Mortier, ripped open Duroc's abdomen, and struck General Kurganer dead on the spot. Napoleon hastened to Duroc as soon as he heard of the event, and was deeply moved on beholding him. The latter, who was still conscious, said to the emperor, "All my life has been devoted to your service, and I only regret its loss for the use which it might still have been to you." "Duroc," replied the emperor, "there is another life. It is there that you will await me, and there we shall one day meet." "Yes, sire, but that will be in 30 years when you shall have triumphed over your enemies and realized the hopes of your country. I have lived an honest man and have nothing to reproach myself with. I leave a daughter. Your Majesty will be a father to her." At Duroc's own solicitation, the emperor retired to spare him further grief. Napoleon had ordered his troops to halt, and he remained all the afternoon in front of his tent, surrounded by the guard, who did not witness his affliction without tears. He stood by Duroc while he died and drew up with his own hand an epitaph, to be placed over his remains by the pastor of the place, and who received 200 Napoleons to defray the expense of a fitting monument. Thus closed the 22nd. That night Napoleon, after dictating the bulletin of the battle, wrote the following decree, which, says Alison, all lovers of the arts, as well as admirers of patriotic virtue, must regret was prevented by his fall from being carried into execution. "A monument shall be erected on Mount Cenis. On the most conspicuous space the following inscription shall be written. The Emperor Napoleon, from the field of Werschen, has ordered the erection of this monument in testimony of his gratitude to the people of France and of Italy. This monument will transmit, from age to age, the remembrance of that great epoch, when, in the space of 3 months, 1,200,000 men flew to arms to protect the integrity of the French Empire." The Allies, although strongly posted during the most of the day, had lost 10,000 men. They continued to retreat into Upper Silesia, and Napoleon advanced to Breslau and released the garrison of Glogau. General Regnier obtained fresh advantage over the Russians in the affair of Gorlitz on the following day, and on the 24th Marshal Ney forced the passage of the Nice, and in the morning of the 25th was beyond the Cuisse, where he met the emperor. Meanwhile, the Austrians, having watched these indecisive though bloody fields and daily defeats of the Allies, sought to bring about an armistice, but only with a view of gaining them time to recuperate. The sovereigns of Russia and Prussia expressed a willingness to accept it, and Napoleon also was desirous of bringing his disputes to a peaceful termination until the 10th of August. He agreed to an armistice, and in arranging its conditions, agreed to fall back out of Silesia, thus enabling the Allies to reopen communications with Berlin. On the 1st of June, the lines of truce to be occupied by the armies was signed. The French emperor returned to Dresden, and a general congress of diplomatists prepared to meet at Prague, England alone refusing to send a representative, alleging that Napoleon had as yet signified no intention to recede from his position with regard to Spain. The armistice was arranged purely to gain time. Napoleon's successes, while unproductive, were dazzling in their execution, and the Allies found it of the utmost importance to stop hostilities until the advance of Bernadotte and secure further time for the arrival of new reinforcements from Russia, for the completion of the Prussian organization, and above all, for determining the policy of Vienna. While inferior diplomatists wasted much time in endless discussions at Prague, one interview between Prince Metternich and Napoleon at Dresden brought the whole question to a definite issue. The emperor, during the course of their conversation, is said to have asked, "What is your price? Will Illyria satisfy you? I only wish you to be neutral. I can deal with these Russians and Prussians single-handed." Metternich answered that the time in which Austria could be neutral was past, that the situation of Europe at large must be considered. He declared that the Rhenish Confederacy must be broken up, that France must be contented with the boundary of the Rhine and pretend no longer to maintain her unnatural influence in Germany. Napoleon replied, "Come, Metternich, tell me honestly how much the English have given you to take their part against me." At length, the Austrian court sent a formal document containing its ultimatum, the tenor of which Metternich had indicated in his conversation. Napoleon was urged by his ministers, Talleyrand and Fouché, two arch-intriguers, to accede to the proffered terms. Their arguments were backed by intelligence of the most disastrous character from Spain. Wellington, on perceiving that Napoleon had greatly weakened his armies in that country, while preparing for his campaign against Prussia and Russia, had once more advanced and was now in possession of the supreme authority over the Spanish armies as well as the Portuguese and English, and had appeared in greater force than ever. The French had suffered defeat at several points, and on the 21st of June, Joseph Bonaparte and Marshal Jourdan had sustained a total defeat, and the former was now retreating towards the Pyrenees. Berthier concurred in pressing upon the emperor the desirability of making peace on the terms proposed, or to draw in his garrisons on the Oder and Elbe, whereby he would strengthen his army with 50,000 veterans and retire to the Rhine. There, it was urged, with such a force assembled on such a river, and with all the resources of France behind him, he might bid defiance to the united armies of Europe, and at worst, obtain a peace that would leave him in secure tenure of a nobler dominion than any of the kings his predecessors had even hoped to possess. 10 lost battles, he replied, would not sink me lower than you would have me place myself by my own voluntary act, but 1 battle gained enables me to seize Berlin and Breslau and make peace on terms compatible with my glory. Finally, Metternich suddenly broke off all negotiations, and on the 12th of August, Austria declared war against France. It was an act of bold and shameless perfidy, but Metternich was richly rewarded for his treachery by the crowned heads of Europe. It was then that Napoleon discovered the depth of the abyss on which he had set his foot. He had lived in the hopes that his alliance with the House of Austria, by marriage with Marie-Louise, would prevent the Archduchess' father from taking the field against him, but in this he was sadly disappointed. Austria now signed an alliance, offensive and defensive, with Russia and Prussia. Thus was consolidated at last the Great Coalition. The sovereigns of the nations of Europe had leagued together and sworn to crush the Emperor of France. On the night between the 10th and 11th, rockets answering rockets, from height to height, along the frontiers of Bohemia and Silesia, had announced to all the armies of the Allies this accession of strength and the immediate recommencement of hostilities. Napoleon had now been several weeks with his army at Dresden, and it had been fondly hoped by the populace that on the birthday of the French emperor, a peace with Europe would be signed. They had prepared a magnificent festival in his honor and to celebrate the restoration of peace. Their hopes were considerably lessened, however, by an order for the fete to take place on the 10th in conjunction with a grand review of the army. On the great plain of Ostra-Gehigi, near Dresden, the imperial troops were drawn up, and in the presence of the King of Saxony, the emperor's brothers, marshals, and the chief dignitaries of the empire, Napoleon held his last review. 20,000 of the old guard, 5,000 of whom were mounted on fine horses richly caparisoned, with the whole of his vast army, defiled before their imperial commander. At night, a banquet was spread for his gallant veterans. Military preparations had been progressing on both sides during the cessation of hostilities. Napoleon now had a force of 250,000 men, distributed as follows. MacDonald lay with 100,000 at Bunzlau, on the border of Silesia. Another corps of 50,000 had their headquarters at Zittau, in Lusatia. St. Cyr, with 20,000, was at Pirna, on the great pass from Bohemia. Oudinot at Leipzig, with 60,000. While with the emperor himself at Dresden remained 25,000 of the imperial guard, the flower of France. Behind the Erzgebirge, or metallic mountains, and having their headquarters at Prague, lay the grand army of the Allies, consisting of 120,000 Austrians and 80,000 Russians and Prussians, commanded in chief by the Austrian general Schwarzenberg. The French corps at Zittau and Pirna were prepared to encounter these, should the attempt to force their way into Saxony, either on the right or the left of the Elbe. The Second Army of the Allies, consisting of 80,000 Russians and Prussians, called the Army of Silesia and commanded by Blücher, lay in advance of Breslau. Lastly, the Crown Prince of Sweden, Bernadotte, who had been influenced by a belief that he was to succeed to the throne of France, was at Berlin with 30,000 of his own troops and 60,000 Russians and Prussians. Oudinot and MacDonald were so stationed that he could not approach the upper valley of the Elbe without encountering one of them, and they also had the means of mutual communication and support. Napoleon had evidently arranged his troops with the view of making isolated assaults and beating them in detail. He was opposed, however, by generals who were well acquainted with his tactics, but none of whom, except Blücher, was above mediocre in generalship. The three Allied commanders had prepared counter-schemes to frustrate his arrangements, having agreed that whosoever of them should be first assailed or pressed by the French, they should on no account accept battle, but retreat, thus tempting Napoleon in person to follow, leaving Dresden open to the assault of some other great branch of their confederacy, and to enable them at once to seize all his magazines, to break the communications between the remaining divisions of his army and interpose a hostile force in the rear of them all, between the Elbe and the Rhine. This plan of campaign is believed to have been drawn up by two of Napoleon's old marshals, Bernadotte and Moreau, both traitors. The latter had just returned from America on the invitation of the Emperor Alexander, whither he had gone after being exiled, and had joined the Allies in their warfare on the French emperor. The first movement was made by Blücher, and no sooner did Napoleon become aware that he was threatening the position of MacDonald than he quitted Dresden. He left with his guard and a powerful force of cavalry on the 15th of August, and proceeded to the support of his marshal. The Prussian commander adhered faithfully to the general plan and retired across the Katzbach in the face of his enemies. While in pursuit of him, Napoleon was informed that Schwarzenberg had rushed down from the Bohemian hills and, abandoning Blücher to the care of MacDonald, sent his guard back to Dresden, leaving for the same point himself on the 23rd. Schwarzenberg made his appearance on the heights to the south of the Saxon capital on the 25th, having driven St. Cyr and his 20,000 men before him. The army of St. Cyr had thrown itself into the city of Dresden, and on the 26th were assailed in 6 columns, each more numerous than its garrison. The French marshal had about begun to despair when the Imperial Guard made its appearance, crossing the bridge from the eastern side of the Elbe, and in their midst was the Emperor himself. His arrival was most timely, and the 2 sallies executed by those troops, hot and tired from their long and tiresome march, caused the Allies to be driven back some distance. Night then set in, and the 2 armies remained very near together until the next morning, when the battle was renewed amidst a storm of wind and rain. The Emperor, by movements most phenomenal, now had 200,000 men gathered round him, and he poured them out with such skill on either flank of the enemy's line that ere the close of the day they were forced to withdraw. At 3 o'clock, the Battle of Dresden was definitely gained for Napoleon. The Allied monarchs, in danger of losing their communication with Bohemia, were obliged to provide for their safety and beat a retreat, leaving in the power of the conqueror from 25 to 30,000 prisoners, 40 flags, and 60 pieces of cannon. Napoleon remained on the field until his victory was decided, and then returned to Dresden on horseback, his gray coat and weather-worn hat streaming with water, and his whole appearance forming a singular contrast to that of Murat, who rode by his side with all the splendor of his usual battle dress. The latter had, however, especially distinguished himself during the action. On either side, 8,000 men had been slain or wounded, and one of the ablest of all the enemy's generals, Moreau, had fallen. Early in the day, Napoleon had observed a group of reconnoitering officers and ordered that 10 cannon be prepared at once. He believed that he recognized in the group the traitor Moreau. He at once ordered that the heavy guns, charged with all their power, be pointed in that direction. He superintended the operation and decided himself the angle of elevation, the aim, and the moment to fire. 10 pieces went off at once, carrying a storm of cannon shot over the heads of the contending armies. This was followed by a movement which was thought to indicate that some person of importance had been wounded. A peasant came in the evening and brought with him a bloody boot and a greyhound, both the property, he said, of a great man who was no more. The words on the dog's collar were, "I belong to General Moreau." Moreau was dead. Both his legs had been shot off. It is said he continued to smoke a cigar while the surgeon dressed his wounds in the presence of Alexander, and died shortly after. The fatigues Napoleon had undergone between the 15th and 28th of August now overcame him, and he was unable to remain with the columns in the rear of Schwarzenberg, but returned to Dresden. Here he learned of Vandam's failure in an engagement in the valley of Kulm with a Prussian corps commanded by Count d'Osterman, wherein the French lieutenant laid down his arms with 8,000 prisoners. This news reached Napoleon, still sick, at Dresden. "Such," he said to Murat, "is the fortune of war. High in the morning, low ere night. Between triumph and ruin there intervenes but one step." No sooner did Blücher perceive that Napoleon had retired from Silesia than he resumed the offensive, still carrying out Moreau's advice: "Attack Napoleon where he is not," and descended from the position he had taken at Jower. He encountered MacDonald, who was by no means prepared for him, on the plains between Wallstatt and the river Katzbach on the 26th of August, and after a hard-fought day, gained a complete victory. The French lost 15,000 men and 100 guns and fell back on Dresden. Oudinot was defeated on the 23rd of August by Bernadotte at Gross-Beeren, and Ney suffered like reverses on the 7th of September at Dennewitz, leaving 10,000 prisoners and 46 guns in the hands of Bernadotte. Napoleon now recovered his health and activity, and the exertions he made at this time were never surpassed, even by himself. On the 3rd of September, he was in quest of Blücher, who had now advanced near to the Elbe, but the Prussians retired and baffled him as before. Returning to Dresden, he received the news of Dennewitz, and immediately afterwards heard that Wittgenstein had a second time descended towards Pirna. He flew thither on the instant. The Russian gave way, according to the plan of campaign, and Napoleon returned once more to Dresden. Again he was told that Blücher on the one side and Wittgenstein on the other were availing themselves of his absence and advancing. He once more returned to Pirna. A third time the Russian retired. Napoleon followed him as far as Peterswald and once more returned to his center point. Bernadotte and Blücher finally effected a junction to the west of the Elbe, despite the heroic exertions of Ney, who, on witnessing the combination of these armies, retreated to Leipzig. Napoleon now ordered Regnier and Bertrand to march suddenly from Dresden to Berlin in the hope of recalling Blücher, but without success. Meantime, Schwarzenberg was found to be skirting round the hills to the westward, as if for the purpose of joining Blücher and Bernadotte in the neighborhood of Leipzig. It became manifest that Leipzig was now becoming the common center towards which the forces of France and all her enemies were converging. Napoleon reached that venerable city on the 15th of October, and almost immediately the heads of Schwarzenberg's columns began to appear towards the south. Napoleon, having made all his preparations, reconnoitered every outpost in person and distributed eagles to some new regiments which had just joined him. The young soldiers, with a splendid ceremony, swore to die rather than witness the dishonor of France. 500,000 men were now in presence of each other, under the walls or in the environs of Leipzig, and a grand battle had become inevitable. At midnight, 3 rockets, emitting a brilliant white light, sprang into the heavens to the south of the city. These marked the position on which Schwarzenberg, having with him the Emperor of Austria, as well as Alexander and Frederick William, had fixed his headquarters. They were answered by 4 rockets of a deep red color ascending from the northern horizon. Napoleon now became convinced that he was to sustain on the morrow the assault of Blücher and Bernadotte, as well as the grand army of the Allies. Blücher was indeed ready to cooperate with Schwarzenberg, and though the crown prince had not yet reached his ground, the numerical strength of the enemy was very great. Napoleon had with him to defend the line of villages to the north and south of Leipzig, 134,000 infantry and 22,000 cavalry, while even in the absence of Bernadotte, who might be hourly looked for, the Allies mustered not less than 340,000 combatants, including 54,000 cavalry. At daybreak on the 16th of October, the battle began on the southern side, the Allies charging the French line there 6 times in succession, and were as often repelled. But it was not sufficient for the emperor to resist with success and to hold his positions. He had, more than ever, need of a signal triumph, of a decisive victory. And when his enemies failed in their first attack, it was for him to attack them briskly in turn, without giving them time to stay the disorder and discouragement of their columns, and to replace by fresh troops the fatigued and beaten soldiers. And this Napoleon did. He at once charged, and with such effect that Murat's cavalry were at one time in possession of a great gap between the two wings of the enemy. The Cossacks of the Russian Imperial Guard, however, encountered the French horse and pushed them back again, preserving the army of the Allies from a total defeat. The combat raged without intermission until nightfall, when both armies bivouacked exactly where the morning light had found them. The Allies were so numerous, said Napoleon at St. Helena, that when their troops were fatigued, they were regularly relieved as on dress parade. With such a numerical superiority, they could scarcely be definitely beaten. Therefore, notwithstanding the prodigies of valor performed by the French army, the victory remained almost undecided. In the center and to the right, the French had maintained their position, but on the left, treachery made them lose ground. Marmont commanded on this side. Blücher attacked him with a vastly superior force in numbers, and while nothing could be more obstinate than his defense, he lost many prisoners and guns, was driven from his original ground, and occupied, when the day closed, a new position, much nearer the walls of the city. Napoleon became convinced that he must at last retreat from Leipzig, and he now made an effort to obtain peace. General Merfeld, the same Austrian officer who had come to his headquarters after the Battle of Austerlitz to pray for an armistice on the part of the Emperor Francis, had been made prisoner in the course of the day, and Napoleon resolved to employ him as his messenger. Merfeld informed him that the King of Bavaria had at length acceded to the alliance, thus adding greatly to his perplexities in finding a new enemy stationed on the line of his march to France. The emperor asked the Austrian to request for him the personal intervention of Francis. "I will renounce Poland and Illyria," said he, "Holland, the Hanse towns, and Spain. I will consent to lose the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Italy, provided that state remain as an independent one, and I will evacuate all Germany. Adieu, Count Merfeld. When on my part you name the word armistice to the two emperors, I doubt not the sound will awaken many recollections." Napoleon received no answer to his message. The Allied princes had sworn to each other to entertain no treaty, while one French soldier remained on the eastern side of the Rhine. He therefore prepared for the difficult task of retreating with 100,000 men through a crowded town in presence of an enemy already twice as numerous, and in hourly expectation of being joined by a third great and victorious army. During the 17th, the battle was not renewed except by a distant and partial cannonade. The Allies were determined to have the support of Bernadotte in the decisive contest. On the morning of the 18th, the battle began again about 8 o'clock and continued until nightfall without intermission. Never was Napoleon's generalship or the gallantry of his troops more thoroughly tested than on this terrible day. He again commanded on the south, and again, in spite of the vast superiority of the enemy's numbers, the French maintained their ground to the end. On the north, the arrival of Bernadotte enabled Blücher to push his advantages with irresistible effect, and the situation of Marmont and Ney was further perplexed by the shameful defection of 12,000 Saxons who went over with all their artillery to the enemy in the very midst of the battle. These Saxons, forming nearly a third of the left, ran over to the Russians, entered their ranks, and at Bernadotte's request discharged their artillery on the French, their fellow soldiers, whom they had just abandoned. The loss on either side had been very great. Napoleon's army consisted chiefly of very young men. Many were merely boys, yet they fought as bravely as the Guard. The failure of the emperor was partly occasioned by a want of ammunition, as in the course of 5 days, having fired more than 250,000 shots, his troops had not sufficient to continue the firing 2 hours longer. As the nearest reserves were at Magdeburg and Erfurt, Napoleon determined to march for the latter place. He gave orders at midnight for the commencement of the inevitable retreat, and while the darkness lasted, the troops continued to file through the town and across the 2 bridges over the place beyond its walls. One of these bridges was a temporary fabric and broke down ere daylight came to show the enemy the movement of the retreating French. The confusion necessarily accompanying the march of a whole army through narrow streets and upon a single bridge was fearful. The Allies stormed at the gates on either side, and, but for the heroism of MacDonald and Poniatowski, to whom Napoleon entrusted the defense of the suburbs, it is doubted whether he himself could have escaped in safety. At 9 in the morning of the 19th, Napoleon bade farewell to the King of Saxony, who had remained all the while in the heart of his ancient city. The king was left to make whatever terms he could with the Allied sovereigns. The battle was now raging all round the walls, and at 11 o'clock the Allies had gathered close to the bridge. The officer to whom Napoleon had committed the task of blowing up the structure when the advance of the enemy should render this necessary, set fire to the train much too soon. The crowd of men, urging each other on to a point of safety, could not at once be stopped, and soldiers, horses, and cannon rolled headlong into the deep but narrow river. Marshal MacDonald swam the stream in safety, but the gallant Poniatowski, who defended the suburbs inch by inch, and had been twice wounded ere he plunged his horse into the current, sank to rise no more. This order was given to Poniatowski by the emperor himself. "Prince," said Napoleon to him, "you will defend the southern faubourg." "Sire," he replied, "I have but few people." "Ah, well, you will defend yourself with what you have." "Ah, sire, we will maintain it." "We are always ready to perish for your majesty." The illustrious, unfortunate Pole kept his word. He was never again to behold the emperor. Later Napoleon said of him, "Poniatowski was a noble man, honorable and brave. Had I succeeded in Russia, I intended to make him king of Poland." The body of the prince was found on the 5th day by a fisherman. He had on his gala uniform, the epaulettes of which were studded with diamonds, and upon his fingers were several rings covered with brilliants, while his pockets contained snuff-boxes of considerable value and other trinkets. Many of these were eagerly purchased by Polish officers who had been made prisoners. 25,000 Frenchmen, the means of escape being entirely cut off, now laid down their arms within the city with more than 200 pieces of cannon. In killed, wounded, and prisoners, Napoleon lost at Leipzig at least 50,000 men. This defeat at Leipzig, says Saint Amand, was for Napoleon a combination of grief and surprise. Of all the battles he had fought, this was the first that he had lost. Up to that time, he could boast that if he had been conquered by the elements, he had never been conquered by man. And now he was to know for himself the sufferings he had inflicted on others. He was to learn by personal experience the bitterness of defeat, the anguish of retreat, the desperation of useless bloodshed. War, which up to this time had been a source of gratification to his unparalleled pride, now showed to him its horrors, with its humiliations and inexpressible anguish. The hour had struck when he could make tardy reflections on the emptiness of genius and glory, on the intoxication of pride that had turned his head. The retreat of the French through Saxony was a sad ending to the auspicious beginning which the emperor had opened the campaign with. Napoleon conducted himself as became a great mind amidst great misfortunes. He appeared at all times calm and self-possessed, receiving every day that he advanced new tidings of evil, for the peasantry was hostile, supplies scarce, and added to this was the persevering pursuit of the Cossacks who attacked at every opportunity. The emperor halted for 2 days at Erfurt, where extensive magazines had been established, employing all his energies in the restoring of discipline. He resumed his march on the 25th of October, 1813, towards the Rhine. The Austro-Bavarians hastened to meet him and had taken up a position amidst the woods near Hanau before the emperor reached the Main. He came up with them on the morning of the 30th, and his troops charged on the instant with the fury of desperation. Napoleon cut his way through ere nightfall, and Marmont with the rear had equal success on the 31st. In these actions, the French lost 6,000 men, but the enemy had 10,000 killed or wounded and lost 4,000 prisoners. The mill on the river Kinzig, which runs without the town, was the scene of many desperate struggles. Here the French drove the Bavarians to the banks, precipitating hundreds into the deep stream. The miller, however, at the risk of his life, at length coolly went out amidst a shower of balls and stopped the floodgates, so as to leave a safe retreat to the Bavarians over the mill dam. The side of the town next to the scene of battle was constantly taken and retaken by the contending armies, and during the night of the 30th, the watchword was changed not less than 7 times. 6 of the Austro-Bavarians' generals were killed or wounded, and both cannon and flags were left in the power of the conqueror. The pursuit of Napoleon, which had been entrusted to the Austrians, was far from vigorous, and no considerable annoyance succeeded the Battle of Hanau. The relics of the French host, now reduced to 60,000 men, at length passed the Rhine, and the emperor, having quitted them at Mayence, arrived in Paris on the 9th of November.
This concludes today's reading of The Military Career of Napoleon the Great by Montgomery Gibbs. Join us also next week for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.